Hey Harvester, with fall wrapping up, today is a great day to be at church. It's a great day to see many of you here. I know some of you have been all over the place this summer, but this is the time where vacations are wrapping up, kids are going back to school, fall routines are coming back. It's good to see you. One of the things that we talked about before service started, I want to make sure that you heard about, was our connection space that's coming up to help you get connected for the first time at Harvester or maybe even reconnected into a group. If your group has stopped or has kind of like lost its steam through the summer and maybe you're not even sure if you're in a group anymore or if your group meets, connection space is the place for you. Now, if you are in a group, connection space is not for you. But if you're already connected, stay connected there. But if you are looking for a place to get to know some other people, I know we've seen a ton of new faces around Harvester these last few months. If you're ready to say, you know what, I'm ready to make church more than a program, I'm ready to make it my people, connection space is a great place to see that happen. It's a 6-week event that happens starting next Tuesday, August 22nd. If you have been thinking about or talking about getting into a group and meeting people at Harvester and studying the Bible together, August 22nd, it's Tuesday evening. For the next 6 weeks after that, we're gonna be having the connection space. It's gonna be down here in the landing on Tuesday evenings. You're gonna get to sit around some tables, meet some people who are also looking for a group. And my prayer is that by the end of that 6 weeks, you found a people at Harvester who you can be in a group with, and then maybe even meet up on Sundays during service, sit together, worship together, and make that your people at Harvester. I realize this is a big place. The best thing you can do to help it not be a big place is be intentional about getting into relationships. But I know relationships are hard, yeah? Anybody experience that? Relationships are hard? That's why we're in this series that we're in, this thing between us. Someone told me last week that, man, this series is really tough because I'm sitting next to the people that I don't want to be having this conversation in earshot of. Dismissiveness is something we talked about last week. Today's gonna be another difficult one. We're talking about distractions. And I know there are distractions in your relationships, that there is something between you, typically your phone, typically other people, typically a TV, typically pursuits that get between us and really distract us from one another. And if we're gonna talk about relationships, we need to talk about the things that bring ruin to those relationships. And distractions is one of those. What I've seen and what I've witnessed is that relationships don't die with one thing happening into a relationship. It's usually something that happens over and over and over. Relationships die by the death of 1,000 paper cuts. And that's what distractions are. They're little things that don't seem like much, but when they happen over and over and they grow between you, they begin to divide you. What we're doing during this series is looking at the story of Adam and Eve and God and their relationship in the Garden of Eden. So grab your Bibles, open up to Genesis chapter 3. Today we're gonna look at one verse in Genesis chapter 3. It's a continuation from the verses we were looking at last week. But let me remind you where we're coming from, for those of you who are new to this, is that Genesis and the book of Genesis and the whole Bible itself starts off with relationship in mind, of a relationship between Adam and Eve and a relationship between Adam and Eve and God. And God has created this beautiful place to put us. It's called the world, a place for our relationships to thrive and to grow in. In fact, God calls it good. But then in the midst of the very beginning of the story, this devil gets between us in our relationships with one another, but also our relationship with God. And he begins to use these tactics that he used not just in that relationship, but in every relationship afterwards to separate us. And so what we're doing in this series is examining some of those tactics that Satan used then and asking ourselves the question is, might Satan also be using that same tactic to destroy the relationships that I'm in today? And my guess is the answer is yes. And so this might feel very personal for you in some of your current relationships or some of your past relationships. But until we deal with those devils between us, we'll never get to experience the grace that God has for us. So Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Let's look at a distracting devil today. Here's the story. It says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, you know the story. There was multiple trees in the garden, and God said, here's the good ones, but this one is bad. Satan turned their eyes away from God and started directing them towards the bad tree in the garden. It says, when the woman saw that this tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, what did she do? She took of its fruit, and she ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was there with her, and he ate it as well. Now, right off the bat, here's something you need to know. This is just a side note. It says that her husband who was there with her. I know some of you just really rag on Eve. It wasn't just Eve that ate of this fruit. Where was Adam the whole time? Right beside her. It wasn't just the devil between Satan and Eve. It was the devil between their relationship and God. And it all got messed up. Not just because of Eve, because of Adam too. Amen, women? Amen. There we go. So what does Satan do here? That's what I want to look at today. What does Satan do here? Satan redirects their eyes from God to grow their appetite for something lesser in the garden. God gave them something amazing in that garden. He gave them each other, yes. He gave them a great context for a relationship, yes. But he also gave them a great way to interact with him, yes, in that garden. And so what does Satan do? He comes in and he takes their eyes off of God, he takes their eyes off of each other, and he redirects it to something else, a distraction, something that was lesser. And what he does is he makes them desire that more than they desired each other and God. And that's what a distraction is. And that's how Satan used distractions. He will enter something into the relationship that will make you desire that more than the relationship itself. He will grow your appetite for something lesser. 3 appetites that Satan grows in this passage. The first one is this, their physical appetite. It says that when Eve saw the tree, that it was good for what? Food. She looked at this tree and she's like, man, that creates some kind of appetite in my stomach. Yes, I have all this food to eat in the garden, but this tree, when I look at it, you know what, Satan, you're right. This does look tasty. And what begins to happen in her? This physical appetite for that begins to grow. And I think Satan increases our physical appetite for other things to distract us in our most important relationships. I think many people are distracted by this incessant need to feel ourselves with pleasures of this world. And those become distractions in our relationships, don't they? Our body desires something. And so we go searching for that something outside of the relationship, the primary relationships that we have, because all of a sudden we think, well, maybe that will fill me in a way that this relationship doesn't fill me. People do that with sex. People do that with pornography. People do that with alcohol. People do that with food. I think people also look at their body and say, like, this physical appetite for fitness is where I'm gonna focus all of my attention on just me and my physical body or my image. And what begins to happen is all these physical pleasures around us distract us from our core relationships. And then what we begin to do is we begin to trade our core relationships for those physical appetites. But it's not just physical, but it's also emotional. Appetite was raised in Adam and Eve in the garden. It says that they looked at the tree and it wasn't just good for food, but it was also a delight to the eyes. This word delight, the Hebrew word for this, has a lot of implications with it. It's not just that it looked good, that it was shiny, that it was flashy, but delight as in there was this yearning deep down inside. That when they saw this, all of a sudden, something happened at a deeper level. Like this hope, when they looked at it, began to grow inside of them as if, like, maybe that's what I need. It was like deep down into the heart. It's that idea of saying, you know what, this makes me feel more. It doesn't just fill me, but it makes me feel. And I think a lot of times we get emotionally distracted in our relationships. And what begins to happen is our emotional appetite outside of the relationship begins to grow. I've seen people who are distracted by coworkers from their primary relationships. They have a coworker who it's like, for some reason, this person begins to make me feel a different way than this person at home makes me feel. And so my heart is now drawn this way, and there's this emotional attraction and this emotional appetite that begins to well up, and then that begins to ruin the other relationship. But it's not just people, it's other things as well, where we're seeking out this emotional release that we're not getting in our relationship. I see a lot of younger people specifically, they jump into like head, heart, and hands into the video game world of, I'm gonna jump into this fantasy world with these people that I don't really know because they make me feel a different way than the people around me. Or I'm gonna jump into these books and this reading because I can experience their emotion when I'm not experiencing anything. Or how many of you, like when you're not feeling anything, you decide just to scroll through TikTok videos or Instagram reels because these are things that make you have feeling. Can I be honest with you? That's a distraction for me. Whenever I've had a rough day, you know where I go? When I just want to feel joy or feel laughter, you know where I go? I go to Instagram Reels and I look at office bloopers or Parks and Rec clips or comedians because I sit there and I'll scroll for hours just laughing at my phone because it feels like in the world, nobody else can provide that for me. And so I've got to chase after those other things. We're looking for things that will make us laugh, cry, feel love or joy. We're just looking for something else that will make us feel. And essentially what Satan is doing is he's growing our appetite for emotional things outside of the relationship that was meant to be our primary relationship and provider of those things. But it's not just physical, it's not just emotional, but there's one more thing here that Satan begins to grow in them. It's their intellectual appetite as well. I know some of you are thinking, oh, that's that physical stuff, that emotional stuff, that's not me. I wonder if it might be intellectual pursuits that pull you out of relationships, where there's this desire to look at something as like, that's something that will fill my brain. That's something that will make me wise. Maybe you're in a relationship with someone you really care about, but they can't really carry the conversation at the level that you desire. And so you go to other places and have those conversations in other places. Or maybe there's this career that the relationship really isn't fulfilling you, but this pursuit of a career that if I can just pour all of my head into reading and studying and working over hours to pursue this career, maybe that will fill me up. Or maybe instead of, tell me if this doesn't ring true for some of you, sitting at the table having a conversation with someone that you love about, instead what is more enjoyable to you is sitting at that table and thinking about the things you wish you would have said to somebody else. We go through these intellectual practices of just defending and fighting and debating other people who are not at the table with us, when the whole time the person who loves us and cares for us is sitting right there. You know, I think that's what Satan does. He brings in these distractions that increases our appetite for lesser things. Now, I'll be honest with you, some of it's dark and needs to just be outright rejected out of our lives. But some of these things aren't bad things. Some of these things could be considered good things. You look at the story of Adam and Eve, and what God placed them in was good, wasn't it? That's the word that was used to define it. It was good. But Satan has a way of coming in and taking something good to distract you from what is best. And I'll tell you this, anytime something good distracts you from what matters most, a good thing becomes a dangerous thing. A good thing can become a dangerous thing when it distracts you from what matters most. Satan will increase your appetite for lesser things to destroy the most important things in your life. And I think we, like Adam and Eve, we are masters at trading our greatest joys for momentary distractions. This distraction that Adam and Eve was distracted with, this tree in the garden, caused them to forget the most important thing. Satan comes in and says, look at this, it's beautiful, it'll make you wise, it's great to look at, it'll fill your belly. And all the while, what did they forget? They forgot what God told them about that distraction, that it will kill you, that it will bring death to you. And what did it do? It brought death to their relationship. And my fear is that for many of us, we have these distractions around us and we don't know the reality of what those distractions can do. Sure, they may not physically kill you, but here's what they will do. Distractions will bring death to your relationships. unless you do something about it. So what I want to do today is just share 4 things that we can do when dealing with distractions in our lives. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few instances of how Jesus dealt with distractions. And my hope is that you will be able to apply those into the various relationships in your life. So here's what you need to do for this series to be impactful for you in your situation. Number 1 is you need to identify what the primary relationships are in your life. Okay? So when we're talking relationship, what does that mean for you? I know that means a lot of different things for a lot of different people in this room. If you're married, my hope is that your spouse is one of those primary relationships, that you'll identify that relationship as primary. I know there's a ton of you not married, so maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a mother or father relationship or a coworker. This also applies in the workplace. So what is that primary relationship? And then what are you gonna do to make sure that it thrives? 4 things that we need to do. Number 1 is you need to know your direction. You need to know the direction of the primary relationships in your life. Here's a truth about relationships. Relationships do not thrive on autopilot, but we assume they do. Most of us assume all I really need to do is get into the relationship. Once I'm in the relationship, then it'll be fine. It'll just drive itself down the road of health, and it'll just grow on its own. It'll be wonderful and beautiful. All I need to do is get into it. But relationships don't thrive on autopilot. You have to be intentional. And you have to be intentional about where it's driving to, where it's going, what direction is the relationship going. Because here's the reason why. It's easy to get distracted when you don't know where you're going. Amen? When you don't know where you're going, it's easy to get distracted. For those of you who are in the business place, one of the most important tools in your workplace is your mission, your work's mission, the company's mission. And what's the purpose of that mission? To get you to the desired destination, to keep you from following distractions. I think we put that into practice in our work lives, but very few of us put that into practice in our relationships. We're just like, I don't know where my marriage is going. Can I ask you, why are you married? What's the purpose of being married? Is it to wake up and to be married another day? I feel like that's how most of us operate. Why do we have our friends? What's the purpose of those relationships? Is it to see how long this friendship could last? Or is there a place that it's leading? What's your desired destination of your relationship? That'd be a great conversation to have in all of your primary relationships of, what do we desire out of this marriage? Where are we moving towards? What do we desire out of this friendship? What are we moving towards? In Matthew chapter 4, we get to see how specific Jesus was about holding on to his direction and his emphasis on relationships, specifically with his relationship with God. Matthew chapter 4, it's an interesting passage to me because of what precedes it. Previously in chapter 3, we get to see Jesus being baptized. And in the midst of his baptism, God speaks truth about his relationship over Jesus. And we often miss this, that in the middle of baptism, God says, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." Essentially, he affirms the relationship, not just for Jesus' sake, but for everybody's sake around him who's there at the baptism. He says, "This is my son." He affirms that relationship. And what's the very next thing that happens? Chapter 4, which is Jesus is led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. First comes relationship, and then comes temptation. Almost all the time in every story, how does the Bible start? First comes relationship, and then comes temptation. That's how Satan works. What does Satan want to destroy? He wants to destroy your relationships. Jesus understands this. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus, he's out in the wilderness and he hasn't eaten for 40 days. So by this time, his physical appetite it's barking. He's hungry. He's ready for some food, but there's something else that he desires more. There's this relationship that he's focused on. But just like in the Garden of Eden, Satan finds his way into the middle of that relationship and tries to get between it. It says this in verse 3 and 4. It says, "The tempter came and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God,'" what's he doing here? He's beginning to dismiss what God has said. Did God really say that you are the Son of God? What did he say to Adam and Eve last week? Did God really say, "Don't eat the fruit of that tree"? And now Satan pops up and he's saying the same things. Did God really say you're the Son of God? If he did, then Command these stones to become loaves of bread. What's Satan doing here? He's trying to tempt Jesus in the same way that he tempted Adam and Eve. Well, look at this tree. Doesn't this grow something in your belly? Wouldn't you want to eat of this? Then to Jesus, well, look at this stone. You could turn this into bread. You can chase after this. Doesn't this make you hungry for something more than what God has brought you out here to experience? What I love about Jesus is Jesus knew what he was after. He knew what was most important. He knew the direction of his relationship. So his response was, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. He says, yes, I'm hungry, but I'm hungry for something more. And I will not be turned aside by something lesser. I know what I want. Yes, I want bread, but what I want more than bread is I want my relationship with God to be intact. Can I tell you, I wish this is what Adam and Eve would have said to Satan. To look him in the eyes and say, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to come between us, but there's something more important than my appetite. It's my relationships. It's my relationship with God. And so I think the question we need to ask is, where is our relationship going? And are we hungry for that? Do you really want a healthy marriage? Do you really want a healthy relationship between you and your parents? Do you really want a healthy friendship? Define it, set a target on it, and then go that direction. And don't let anything come in between you. Know your direction. But after you know your direction, you need to do a second thing. Not just know your direction, but also know what distracts you. Know your distractions. I'm assuming that you are self-aware enough to know right now the things that Satan would use to distract you. Does everybody know that? Can you start to kind of think about what those things are? When Satan looks at you and your marriage, what would he use to distract you from your marriage? What would he use to distract you from your friendships? Know what those distractions are. And then maybe put them down on paper. Write them down. If you're gonna write down the direction of your relationship, also write down what those exit ramps could potentially be. Know them. Are they physical exit ramps? Where there's something physical that Satan knows, I know how to get you. There's this thing, this addiction that you have, and I can bring that to you, and you will choose it every time over your relationship. Or is it this emotional pool? Or is it this intellectual pursuit where Satan's like, I can use this and overwhelm you with this so that you never focus on those relationships. That's what God did for Adam and Eve. Unfortunately, I don't think Adam and Eve did it for themselves. God comes and says, here's the trees to eat, stay away from this one. This one's gonna distract you. Eat these, don't eat these. The devil comes and says, eat this. And Adam and Eve are like, okay. Pinpoint those things and know what they are. I'm guessing you know what they are for yourselves, but maybe if you're a little bit more brave in your relationship, there's something else you can do, something a little bit more tough. Sit across from that person that you care about and ask them. Ask them this, what distracts me from you? What distracts me from you? We've known each other for a while now, and I'm guessing there's been times where you felt that I'm distracted. What typically are those things that distract me from you? I want to know what they are. I don't just want to assume what they are. And then maybe there's something else that we need to do when it comes to distractions, is that we also need to define and pinpoint what things are not distractions. And I think this is maybe something that I've needed to press in a little bit more to. Because what I'm realizing in my relationships is that there are times where I feel like a distraction has entered the room, but that distraction is actually my primary relationship. You feel what I'm saying right now? I've got a son who I love to death. I love this whole series, these last few weeks, feels like I'm ragging on my kids, but I do love my kids. Not a great person. But he's got this phrase that he uses now, Dad, watch this. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Anybody have a kid like every 5 seconds? Dad, watch this. Dad, watch this. And he got me the first few times. The first few times I'm like, he's gonna do something amazing. He's never done anything amazing after saying, Dad, watch this. But there's this part of me that begins to think that he's distracting me from something important. And so what I've had to do is I've had to pinpoint that my kids are not a distraction. And I think what we need to do is define what things are not a distraction, because unless we do, what Satan will convince you of is that those primary people, those primary relationships, those important times are distractions. And watching the television show is not. That I just need to rest, it's been a long day. Or my life is so hard, I can't deal with this right now. And then a kid who I love dearly will come in, and Satan will convince me that that's the distraction. We need to pinpoint what's not a distraction. Can I tell you, when your kid interrupts you, that is not a distraction. I don't care what you're doing. If you're working and your kid comes in to your desk while you're in the middle of a meeting, your kid is not a distraction. If you're watching a TV show and your spouse wants to have a conversation about the day before you find out who the murderer was, she is not the distraction. When you're working hard in your office and a coworker comes knocking and they've got something they want to talk about, maybe they're not the distraction. We have to leave an open door for our primary relationships because they're not the distractions. Know what your distractions are, also know what they're not. If we're going to know our direction and our distractions, then we need to do this third thing, is to be intentional. Be intentional in your relationships. The reality of distractions is you cannot stop distractions. You will be distracted in every context of your life, in every relationship of your life. Distractions will come in. You can't stop distractions, but you can prepare for distractions. You can be ready for when they come. Or you can set aside time that's designed to keep the distractions away. One practical thing that you can do is this: calendar undistracted times. I'm a calendaring person. I calendar my entire life out. I put it on the calendar. I share it with my wife. I share it with my coworkers. I live and die by the calendar. One of the things that I've had to learn to do is to put my primary relationships on calendars as well. Not everything we do, but I do need to calendar undistracted times. Because I'll be honest with you, I'm distracted a lot. And I'll be honest with you also, relationships don't come easy to me. If I'm not focused on it, I'm gonna assume that autopilot will just care for it. One of the things that my wife and I did to start this year off is, instead of doing a New Year's resolution, we created a rule of life. And in that rule of life, we put the things that were most important to us in life. And many of those things were relationships. And we spent a whole day together just talking about our rule of life and what we wanted to do for that. And one of the things that I put on there is that I need to create undistracted time in my calendar for the people who are most important to me. And so one of the things that we put in place was, this year in 2023, we're gonna get back to our date days. When we were young and newly married, we were great at taking dates and creating time, but the older you get and the more that happens in life, it's really easy for distractions to come in and then that to go by the wayside. This year we decided, let's put it back on the calendar and let's stick to it. Let's do lunch on Friday and get away from everything and really just focus on one another. Not talk about work. Let's just talk about our faith and our relationship and talk about where we desire our marriage to go and what the direction of our relationship was. But I didn't just need to do it for my wife, I also needed to do it for my kids. My kids are getting a little bit older. When kids are younger, it's easy to have time with them because they're so needy. They need everything from you. They rely on you for everything. They're always there. I do love my kids. But the older they get, the less they need you, the less they come for you for things. And so I began to realize that if we're gonna continue a strong relationship, I'm gonna have to come to them and be purposeful about those relationships. And so I've been intentional this year about purposefully trying to schedule time to have coffee with my oldest daughter who loves coffee. My youngest daughter, she's the middle child, 15 years old, permit right now. And so we have undistracted time driving the streets of St. Charles. I'm so sorry, guys. I know we are your distraction when we're driving around, but it's great time to spend together in the car just talking about life and then grabbing a 50-cent drink after a Cardinal win, the 3 times that's happened this year, afterwards. My son, I've been purposeful about trying to say yes more when I get home from work and he wants to throw the ball around. And that's when he has his best times of conversation. Just outside, throwing a ball around, that's when we talk about school and life and what's going on in his heart. And we have to be purposeful about making sure that we have that undistracted time. You've got to be intentional. Autopilot won't work for any relationship. But then after you're in those moments, here's what you need to do. Be in the moment. Don't just be intentional about creating the moment, but be intentional about being in the moment as well. I know it's easy to create the moment. The thing that's a lot harder to do is to focus once you're in the moment, isn't it? I mean, I've sat across a table with a child or my wife and undistracted calendar time and not been in the moment where the phone lights up. And I feel like, I've got to look at that. I've got to look at that. Or you feel the buzz. And all of a sudden these distractions enter into the moment and Satan tries to take you out of even those moments. We have to learn to be in the moment, to be willing to focus. And then when we get out of focus, to refocus and learn to refocus again. It's something that we've got to get better at. And the only way to get better at it is practicing it. You know who practiced that really well? A man named Jesus. There's this great story. Turn over to Luke chapter 8. Where we get to see what Jesus looks like when he's in the moment. In Luke chapter 8, there's a lot going around in Jesus' life and a lot that can distract him from his mission and what he's setting out to do. In fact, there's this one story where this guy comes up to him in this crowd and says, Jesus, I need you to come to my house. My daughter's health is failing and I need you to pray over her so that she doesn't die. And so what does Jesus do? He packs up the troops and he begins to head towards that home. And as he's heading towards that home, there's this whole crowd of people pressing in on him. And in Luke chapter 8, verse 42, this is what it says. It says, as Jesus went, the people pressed around him. This word pressed means to like crushed in around him. And why were they crushing in around him? It's because every single person in that crowd wanted something from him. Everybody wanted something. And so they're pressing around Jesus. There's a lot of distractions around, but he keeps marching. But it goes on to say in verse 43 that there was this woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all of her living on physicians, she couldn't be healed by anyone. So she came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his garment. The emphasis here is that she comes up behind him, as in she like sneaks up behind him. She works her way through the crowd. She doesn't want to bother Jesus. She knows that there's more important things than her troubles. She doesn't want to distract him. She doesn't want any attention, but she feels like if I can just touch the bottom of his robe, the fringe of his garment, maybe I'll get to experience some of the healing that these other people seem to have experienced as well. And so that's what she does. In the middle of all these distractions, she doesn't want to be a distraction. So she reaches out, touches the garment, and then it says, immediately her discharge of blood was stopped. It ceased. And then Jesus stopped. Verse 45, it says, Jesus said, who was it that touched me? When all denied it, Peter said, Master, the crowds surround you and they're pressing in on you. Jesus, everybody's touching you. What do you mean somebody touched you? Everybody here is touching you. But Jesus said, someone touched me, for I perceived that power has gone out from me. I love that the word perceived is used here. Have you ever been in a moment where you perceived something was happening deeper than what was actually happening? Like there's something special that's happening in this moment. That's what Satan wants to distract you from. And the reason we don't feel it is because we're being distracted by other things. Jesus was like, I perceived in this moment that something special just happened. For Jesus, he was present in this moment. This woman was not going to be overlooked. Nothing would get between him and her. The woman recognizes that she had been found, and verse 47, it says, when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. I love the tender words that Jesus uses in this moment, where he perceived that a daughter was in his presence that needed something. And essentially he looks at her and says, "You're not a distraction, you're a daughter. You're not a problem, you're my priority." And I think some of us, we're not in the moment to perceive that something special can happen there. I love that Jesus, he's like, I'm not gonna be distracted by everything else. I got this thing to get to, but I'll get there. I'm gonna take care of that as well. But in this moment, daughter, this is our time. I hear you, I've heard your prayers. I see that you're at the end of the rope. Let me be here for you in this moment. I think a lot of us, we assume that we can just multitask our way through life. I know some of you think that you are master multitaskers. You've bragged about being master multitaskers. Can I tell you this? All the people around you know that you are not a multitasker, a master at multitasking. Your loved ones know that you're not great at multitasking. They've experienced what it feels like for you to multitask in that relationship. You can't multitask your relationship into success. When you're with your people, be with your people. Amen? When you're with your people, be with your people. Turn from the temptation to look at your phone. Turn from the temptation to be distracted by work. Turn from the temptation to answer all the critics in your head. When you're with your people, be with your people. Turn to them. Speak their name. Speak their relationship. Son, daughter, wife, husband, mother, father, friend. You are not a distraction. Never trade them in for something lesser. Never trade them in for something lesser. Satan, he wants to get between you and grow your appetite for that lesser thing so that you'll abandon the most important things. Imagine what your relationships would look like without the distractions. Imagine the joy that you would have then when all those distractions disappear and your appetite is just pointed towards that one person. Imagine finding the joy there instead of searching for it in other places. It starts by knowing your direction, pinpointing your distractions, being intentional, and then being in those moments. Amen?